With these and other stories, I'm Paul DiRienzo with The Torch on the Progressive Radio Network. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky told reporters on Thursday his country was not involved in a drone attack last week on the Kremlin, Russia's seat of government.
We don't attack Putin or Moscow. We fight on our territory. We are defending our villages and cities. We don't have, enough weapons for this.
United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken also denied any U.S. involvement in the attack.
I would take anything coming out of the Kremlin with a very large shaker of salt. So let's see. We'll see what the facts are. And it's really hard to comment or speculate on this without really knowing what the facts are. More generally, as I've said and as we've said, when it comes to Ukraine, which is under daily assault, and not just its incredibly courageous military forces, but its citizens, its men, women, and children being assaulted on a daily basis by this Russian aggression, being bombed out of their homes, their apartments, and their streets, children killed, families torn apart. Well, we leave it to Ukraine to decide how it's going to defend itself and how it's going to try to get back the territory that's been seized from it illegally by Russia over the past 14 months and going back to 2014, back to then.
So to clarify, if Ukraine decided on its own to strike back in Russian territory, the United States would not criticize that.
Again, these are decisions for Ukraine to make about how it's going to defend itself, how it's going to get its territory back, how it's going to restore its territorial integrity and its sovereignty.
But Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says the denials are laughable, claiming Kyiv chooses the means and targets for its strikes exactly as it is instructed by Washington. Video showed several flashes of orange light above the iconic dome of the complex of buildings located in Moscow. There was no reported damage, and Russia's President Vladimir Putin was not in the building. United States National Security spokesperson John Kirby refuted Peskov's statement.
The United States was not involved in this incident in any way, contrary to Mr. Peskov's lies. And that's what they are, just lies. Over the past few days, we've also seen Russia continue to launch dozens of missiles and armed drones into Ukraine, striking civilian homes and killing innocent Ukrainians, including shoppers at a supermarket. Russia is continuing to wage a brutal war against the Ukrainian people, and we're committed to continuing to support Ukraine as they defend their country from that aggression, including, as you just saw this week, with yet another package of security assistance, drawdown authority for the president.
National Security spokesperson John Kirby. The attacks come as the world is waiting for Ukraine to launch an expected spring offensive to regain Russian-held territory in the east of the country and the Crimean Peninsula to the south. In related news, at a press conference in Jerusalem, a Russian reporter asked House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy if his statements critical of the U.S. role in the war means the GOP will support a drawdown. McCarthy was adamant.
Вячеслав Tartakovsky, RIA Novosti, Russia. We know that you don't support the current unlimited and uncontrolled supplies of weaponry and aid to Ukraine. So, can you comment, is it possible if in the near future the U.S. policy regarding sending weaponry to Ukraine will change?
Yeah, I'm not sure. The sound here is not good. Did he say, I don't support aid to Ukraine? No, I vote for aid for Ukraine. I support aid for Ukraine. I do not support what your country has done to Ukraine. I do not support your killing of the children either. And I think for one standpoint, you should pull out. And I don't think it's right. And we will continue to support because the rest of the world sees it just as it is.
House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy. The question apparently hit home. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell felt moved to clarify the Republicans' position on the war in Ukraine.
There was a remarkable exchange yesterday when a Russian reporter tried to put false words in Speaker McCarthy's mouth about alleged Republican opposition to helping Ukraine defeat Russian aggression. Well, the Speaker put him in his place and shut him down. He reminded everyone of his ongoing support of aid to Ukraine and of Republicans' commitment to help our friends win. Republicans are the party of American strength at home and abroad. Equipping Ukraine to defend itself is a direct investment in America's own national security, our national security. As brave Ukrainians degrade the Russian military on the front lines, a major threat to Western security and economic prosperity gets weaker. Our own defense capabilities are actually getting stronger. A large part of the security assistance appropriated for Ukraine actually funds the production of new cutting-edge capabilities for the U.S. military and supports good-paying jobs for skilled American workers right here at home.
Back in the United States, there was political reaction. Presidential candidate John F. Kennedy Jr. has long criticized United States military support for Ukraine.
They killed 14,000 Russians in Donbass. The Ukrainian government, if Mexico did that to expatriate Americans, we'd invade in a second. So, I think we have to put ourselves in the shoes of our opponent. They killed 14,000 Russians in Donbass. The Ukrainian.
Kennedy, whose father was assassinated in 1968 while running for president, is in the midst of his own campaign. He tweeted a response to the drone attack. He says the United States should stop its deranged attempts to stoke tensions around Ukraine, adding his uncle, President John Kennedy, warned against ever again forcing Russia to choose between national humiliation and nuclear war. Kennedy went on, "We should heed his advice." Meanwhile, longtime programmer for community radio station WBAI, Randy Credico, just returned from a 3-week journey to Russia and the Donbass. He was at a rally at the studios of cable news network MSNBC in Midtown Manhattan, protesting on behalf of jailed WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Credico says Russia is doing just fine, but he warns nuclear conflict is possible before Russia would withdraw.
The country's beautiful, the city is beautiful, not so much this morning in the Kremlin after that drone attack, but that's where I was. I was walking through the Kremlin just 2.5 weeks ago, to go see John Reed's tomb and the great big Bill Haywood, all over General Zhukov, I went everywhere in that Red Square, and then I went all over the city. Nobody was chaperoning me. It was just on fire in a good way. It was so busy. Every place was busy. I've never seen so much traffic. It's like the 101 or the 405 in LA. There's so many cars out there, and the trucks are going in and out, and they're building a lot. So I was very impressed in Moscow. The 12 days I was there. The 6 days I was in Donbass was a lot rockier and scarier and over my head. The Donbass is what they call Eastern Ukraine, or Russians call the DPR.
Causing trouble here. You just crossed the border not recognized by your own government.
Right. I know I did. And I heard Tony Blinken say today, reporters don't go to Russia, because they don't want the kind of stuff that I put out there by mainstream media.
So we've heard America supports Ukraine, little Ukraine being invaded by big Russia.
So you got that side presented right here every single day, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. They don't have a different view, and so I got to get it from the Russians' view. I was in an area, Donetsk and Mariupol, and 100% of the people I spoke to on my own don't want to be part of that Ukrainian, whatever it is, idea called Ukraine. Yeah. If it really was never a Ukraine until 1920. 22 or whatever. So there's a lot of misperceptions. We're gaslit with disinformation all day long. Every 2 minutes, Newsweek or Business Insider sending out a story. One's crazier than the next. That Putin is on the verge of suicide.
You're here in front of NBC, the Rainbow Room observation deck. I haven't been here since I was a kid. We used to go, and isn't NBC one of these places that are...
It was when John Chancellor was here, and he called Israel a savage nation. Some of the reporters back then, they did commentary, real commentary. Those days are gone. The good people they had at NBC, I don't know if they were good or bad, but they were much better than, more balanced than what this place is. All it is an infomercial for war and mass surveillance.
We're here for a specific purpose.
for Julian Assange because they've been bad on Julian Assange. We had to pick a place that was easy for people to get to. Near Rockefeller Center, you get all the subways near here. It could have been the New York Times, but that's way to go over there on the west side. How are people on the east side going to get there? We could have picked CNN, but that was not conducive in the atmosphere where people are walking around. It was just not a good spot.
This is the Rainbow Room. This is a famous place in
Yeah.
New York, Rockefeller Center.
This got the blood-stained, covered with blood from the Ludlow massacre in 1914, covered with blood, Operation Gladio, that the Rockefellers and the Mellons financed.
Why did you come here then?
Because we wanted to protest because they're shitty on Assange.
Why is that? How do they do it?
Because they got just watch it. Joanne Reed, that guy in the Morning Joe and his, whatever her name is, anybody else on that show, they're all establishment people. They've been really bad on Assange. They're faux journalists. They're not journalists. These are not journalists. You get more news on the dating game than you do in this fucking joint.
What was your experiences of the war zone as a reporter reporting back to us? What's it look like to you?
Mariupol looked like Dresden, but they're rebuilding. Putin was there before I was there, visiting one of the apartment buildings. You have all these Central Asian Russians that are there from the Caucasus building these wonderful apartment buildings. Three months they have like 100-unit apartment buildings. They're white and they're beautiful, and
You could have been there when this much vaunted offensive by Ukraine happened. You could have been caught in a war zone.
I could have been.
Did you bring your puppy with you?
No. I did see a lot of dogs in the park there. They are rebuilding Mariupol. The place is still littered with mines. They tell you, do not walk on the grass anywhere. People lose their legs walking on grass. And of course, I did the first day I was there. The van was over there, the armored vehicle. I had to walk across.
Who is the most important person you met there as far as
I met a lot of, I can't tell you who I met. I met a lot of people there. I don't want to get into it. I don't want it to be around.
And what did they say? What was their message to America, to an American?
America.
They must have had a message.
Stop escalating the war. Call up Zelensky and tell him it's over. And it will be over. But it's getting too late.
Settlement?
They're not, the Russians aren't giving up. It's going to go nuclear. If there's any kind of movement into Russia, it will go nuclear.
They're not going to trade Donbass for Crimea?
They're keeping both of them. They're not going back. They've lost too much. That's the Minsk Accord. They keep Crimea and they keep Donbass and the other Blast or whatever.
You took a 27-hour train trip?
25.
What was that like? I'm sorry to keep you here. It's so interesting.
Well, listen. It's a 5-hour conversation, 25-hour trip. I was in with a French guy. It's it's like bigger than a toll booth. It's about from here to there. There were 2 beds that came out and a dining room table. And so it was like that. And then you go upstairs on that trip every 3 hours to the restaurant and get another bottle of vodka. Because that was the only way I could get through this. It's impossible to stay sober on this trip.
I thought you were a sober
I was,
guy.
but I started drinking again.
You can't find Stoli in New York, though.
Stolly's made in Utah, you know what I mean? Or Wisconsin or someplace.
Any last message about your show? Tell us about your show on WBAI.
Every Friday at 3 p.m., live on the fly. Not this week, not tomorrow. It's a tribute to Harry Belafonte.
But not everybody in the American left is convinced Russia is correct in pursuing the bloody war, where untold thousands have already died and cities lie in ruins. Radical attorney Stanley Cohen has represented the Weather Underground, a U.S.-based radical group accused of political bombings and Palestinian leaders fighting Israel. Cohen says the United States would never use a primitive weapon like a drone to make a point against Russia.
The notion that a state that designed napalm and supports phosphorus and cluster bombs against civilians in Gaza is going to weigh in, support, or directly be involved, or even smile at the use of a 7-Eleven drone to break a flag is just inane. It's silly. It's ridiculous. This counting angels on the head of a pin has become a talisman among people with regard to what's going on. There are certain facts on the ground in not just Ukraine, but in Russia for decades regarding dissent, regarding political opponents, regarding journalists, regarding the will to struggle, which are very clear. We don't have to begin to craft the rumor mill to force conclusions that support whatever our political premise is, and that's what it is. I have no clue. I have no idea, and I'm not going to spend any time trying to figure out who lit a firecracker on a flagpole in the Kremlin, as whether it be a message or an inane attempt to go after Putin, who's never there. So it's just silly.
The Weather Underground beat everybody to it. They had a couple of firecrackers go off in the U.S. Capitol, I think. back in the
Well,
70s.
I actually represented one of the defendants, Alan Berkman, along with Lynn Stewart, that was accused of the Capitol bombing. There's reality on the ground, there's struggle, there's resistance, and there's rhetoric. It's a shame that Tucker Carlson wasn't here right now, still on Fox, because tonight he'd be blaming it on LGBTQ community members as a distraction or a deflection from the righteous battle against them or people of color or women. It's nonsense. Watching people desperately reach out while entire cities are being laid to ruin, while tens of thousands are injured or lose their lives in their own homes, while there are millions in flight, not what brought me up, and it's not what's going to put me to bed. I have litigated against Putin. I've litigated against FSB in Interpol and elsewhere. What amazes me is the ability of self-professed revolutionaries and leftists and anti-imperialists to somehow separate the reality of the ground domestically under Putin from the reality of what's going on in the Ukraine. The record is there. People deny it. When Carlson was fired by other beasts the other day, watching self-professed leftists making excuses for why he had to remain and why he was this powerful, important voice, and denying a track record of hate, of racism, of misogyny, of Islamophobia, of xenophobia, paints a desperate picture for people that are trying to build coalitions and to break bread with some of the fiends in this country.
How do you account for the Svengali-like appeal of Putin?
There are lots of people that think it's enough to say the enemy of my enemy is my friend and ally. If you're interested in confronting and challenging the industrial military complex in the United States, confront it, challenge it, take it on, get arrested, organize, fight it, shut it down, as they're doing with Zionist programs and supporting Israel in the UK right now. But this notion that I'm going to preach from afar or write articles or do podcasts that support someone who is a domestic beast, someone who has a history of war crimes for 20 years, and somehow that's going to expose NATO, weaken NATO, or weaken and expose the United States is infantile. It's childish. While there is just a horrific actions of war crimes and genocides in the ground right now. One of the things that people have to begin looking at is their own politics. This notion that I could just spew rhetoric and somehow become a freedom fighter is childish.
Katrina vanden Heuvel, she doesn't agree with you, but she shares some of the sentiments that you're expressing and is saying that it's time to negotiate a peaceful settlement and to try, and that might, I know a lot of people who are pro-Ukraine and Randy, who was pro-Russia, they're outraged at the idea of trading Donbass for Crimea to end the war.
Well, my message to her is my message to other Western and white women and men. That's up to Ukrainian people. That's not for us to dictate. The notion that we are going to blackmail or hold over the heads our own individual political drive and aspirations and to force them to make decisions is not only pejorative and dismissive, but it's so totally at odds with self-determination that the left that I grew up in has always supported. It is up to the people on the ground in Ukraine. And the notion that somehow Zelensky is holding hostage 40 million people whose cities have been destroyed, with millions of Ukrainians in flight, with critical injuries, with all sorts of problems, is silly and inane. The nature and extent of resistance on the ground in Palestine is up to Palestinians. People on the outside can support that effort in any way that they can, and it holds true for what's going on in the region and with Ukraine right now.
Radical attorney Stanley Cohen. In related news, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said in a TV interview on Friday, "We are working on preventing a fall of our relations with the U.S. into the abyss of an open armed conflict," adding, "We are already on the verge of this abyss." He says there's no real diplomacy between the two rival nations.